My name is Lauren Whitfield. I'm 38 years old. And the night that shattered everything wasn't when I received my honorable discharge, or when I packed my final duffel bag at Fort Bragg after 15 years of service. It was Christmas Eve at my brother's house in Scarsdale, watching my father rise from his leather armchair with a tumbler of Macallan, commanding the attention of 27 relatives who'd gathered to celebrate family and tradition. "Before we open gifts," he announced, his voice carrying across the living room with the authority of someone who'd never been contradicted about anything that mattered, "I want to address the elephant in the room." His eyes found mine across the crowded space past the 12-foot tree, past my niece's unwrapping early presents, past my mother's anxious smile. "The Army kicked Lauren out for drinking," he declared, each word landing like a physical blow. 15 years of service, and she threw it all away because she couldn't handle the pressure. The silence that followed was absolute. 27 people frozen in place, processing my public humiliation while I sat there absorbing his lie like incoming fire. What they didn't know, what my father refused to acknowledge, was that my discharge papers told a completely different story. A story of heroism so classified that 3 years later, even my own family had never learned the truth. Tonight, that truth would finally surface. The dining room felt like a coliseum where I'd been thrown to the lions for sport. My brother's house in Scarsdale, 6,000 square feet of suburban perfection, complete with crown molding, imported Italian marble, and the kind of open-concept kitchen that gets featured in Architectural Digest. The mahogany table that seated 16 was groaning under Mom's traditional spread. Honey, glazed ham, garlic mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and enough wine to float a yacht. Christmas Eve dinner, 2023. 27 members of the Whitfield extended family gathered to celebrate the holidays, success stories, and the unspoken tradition of publicly dissecting whoever wasn't living up to family expectations. This year, that honor belonged to me. I sat in the middle of the table, still wearing the black sweater I'd chosen specifically because it made me invisible, or so I'd hoped. Around me, conversations buzzed with the energy of people who'd made it in America. Stock portfolios, real estate investments, kids at Ivy League schools, the kind of achievements that got Christmas cards mailed to impressive addresses. The wine was flowing freely. Dom Perignon that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries. Everyone was loose, relaxed, ready to be entertained by whatever drama the evening might provide. That's when Dad stood up. He moved with the theatrical precision of someone who'd spent 40 years commanding boardrooms, his Armani suit perfectly pressed despite 3 hours of holiday festivities. In his right hand, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 whiskey that ran $400 a bottle and was reserved for moments when he wanted to make statements that would be remembered. Before dessert, he announced, his voice cutting through conversations like a blade, "I think we need to address something everyone's been too polite to mention." The room went quiet. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Conversations died. 27 pairs of eyes turned toward the head of the table where Dad stood like a prosecutor, preparing to deliver his closing argument. My stomach dropped like a stone thrown into dark water. "We have someone at this table," he continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered to holiday dinners, who threw away 15 years of military service because she couldn't handle the pressure. He wasn't looking at me yet, but I could feel his words circling like predators, waiting for the right moment to strike. "The Army kicked Lauren out for drinking," he declared, his eyes finally finding mine across the length of that mahogany table. 15 years of what we thought was honorable service, and she threw it all away because she couldn't stay sober. The silence that followed was absolute. 27 people processing my public execution while I sat there absorbing each word like incoming artillery. Cousin Jennifer's mouth fell open. Uncle Robert set down his wine glass with theatrical precision. My nephew, home from Yale for winter break, stared at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong family dinner. Then the reactions started. "Seriously?" Cousin Dave laughed, the sound cutting through the silence like breaking glass. "After all those years telling us how proud we should be of her service? I always wondered why she came home so suddenly," Aunt Patricia added, her voice carrying that mixture of false sympathy and genuine satisfaction that people use when their worst suspicions are confirmed. "No one just leaves the military after 15 years unless something went really wrong. Such a waste," Uncle Robert shook his head with the theatrical disappointment of someone who'd never served anything more dangerous than jury duty. All that training, all those opportunities, and she pissed it away literally. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, it was worse. It was the kind of casual, dismissive amusement that came from people who were completely certain they understood the full story. 27 relatives who'd spent years measuring my worth in terms they could understand, now finally having confirmation that their skepticism had been justified. Mom sat frozen, her eyes fixed on her plate like she could disappear into the pattern of her grandmother's china. Not defending me, not correcting the narrative. Just sitting there while her husband destroyed our daughter in front of the entire family. The real shame, Dad continued, warming to his theme while I felt my face burning with humiliation that had nothing to do with guilt, is that we spent years bragging about Lauren's military career, telling friends and neighbors about our daughter, the soldier. Now we know it was all a lie. All a lie. The phrase hit that dining room like a mortar round, finding its target with precision that came from years of practice in destroying things he didn't understand. What they didn't know, what none of them could know, was that every word he'd just spoken was the lie. That my discharge papers told a completely different story, classified at levels that meant even my own family couldn't learn the truth. That their failure daughter had made choices in service to her country that would haunt her forever, but had nothing to do with alcohol and everything to do with sacrifice they'd never comprehend. The memory hit me like shrapnel. 18 months ago, sitting in a windowless room at the Pentagon while a 2-star general explained why my next mission would require me to accept a dishonorable narrative that would protect operations too sensitive for public knowledge. Why saving American lives would mean sacrificing my reputation. Why heroism sometimes looked like disgrace to people who weren't cleared to know the difference. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd made similar requests to other soldiers whose real stories would never see daylight. "What we're asking you to do will destroy your civilian relationships. Your family will never understand. They'll believe the worst because that's the only story we can tell." I'd accepted those terms, signed papers that meant my real service record would remain classified for decades. Agreed to let the people I loved most think the worst of me because some truths were too dangerous to share, some victories too sensitive to celebrate, some sacrifices too classified to acknowledge. But sitting at that table, watching my father's performance while 27 relatives absorbed every word like gospel truth, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment, but clarity. The choice I'd made to let them think I was a failure rather than compromise operations that kept Americans safe had been the right one, even if it cost me everything I'd thought I cared about. "I just hope you learned your lesson," Dad concluded, raising his whiskey in what was supposed to be a toast but felt like a verdict. "Sometimes hitting rock bottom is what it takes to find your way back up." Rock bottom. While he'd been building his insurance empire, I'd been hitting targets that prevented terrorist attacks. While he'd been measuring success in profit margins, I'd been preventing disasters that would never make headlines because success in my world meant nothing happened. I met his eyes across that table, feeling the weight of truths I could never share, carrying secrets that would die with me rather than compromise the safety of people who would never know how close they'd come to catastrophe. "You're right, Dad," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Sometimes we make sacrifices that other people will never understand." He nodded, satisfied with what he thought was my admission of guilt and gratitude for his public intervention. He had no idea I was talking about something completely different. But in 6 months, when classified documents finally got declassified, when congressional hearings made certain operations public, when the Pentagon released information about missions that had prevented domestic terror attacks, he would understand exactly what kind of sacrifices his failure daughter had actually made. Tonight, though, I would let them think whatever they needed to think. Because some battles aren't fought for family approval. Some battles are fought so families can sit safely around mahogany tables, drinking expensive wine, never knowing how close their perfect world came to collapse. The truth lived in places my family would never see. In classified files locked away in Pentagon vaults. In after-action reports that carried security clearances higher than most generals ever achieved. In the memories of soldiers who'd served beside me in places that didn't exist on any map they'd ever study. But the lie was easier. The lie fit their understanding of failure and disappointment. The lie explained why their daughter had come home from her third deployment different, quieter, carrying weight they couldn't see. The memory always hit the same way, sudden, complete, like stepping on an IED that detonated 15 months after I'd already left the desert. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. September 2022. 112 degrees in the shade. Except there was no shade, just endless sand, and the particular smell of a forward operating base that had been carved out of hostile territory through 18 months of constant vigilance. I was a Medical Service Corps officer attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment, responsible for combat medical operations in what the Pentagon classified as high-intensity asymmetric warfare environments. Translation: places where American soldiers got shot, and I kept them alive long enough to get home to families who would never know how close they'd come to folding flags. The mission that changed everything started like dozens of others: intelligence reports of high-value targets, rapid deployment protocols, the controlled chaos of special operations soldiers preparing to eliminate threats that kept terrorists awake at night, planning attacks on American soil. But this mission went wrong. Not tactically, we completed objectives, neutralized targets, achieved what the after-action reports would call total mission success. The problem was what I witnessed during the 36 hours we spent in that compound. My commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Webb, West Point graduate, decorated combat veteran, the kind of leader who commanded respect through competence and courage, had been making decisions that crossed lines. Not tactical lines, ethical lines. The kind that kept me awake for weeks afterward, trying to reconcile the man I'd served under for 2 years with the actions I'd documented in reports no one wanted to read. It started with prisoner interrogations that violated Geneva Convention protocols, escalated to treatment of civilian populations that made my medical oath feel like a weight I couldn't carry, ended with Webb ordering actions that prevented me from providing medical care to wounded civilians because it would compromise operational security. I filed my report 3 days after we returned to base, detailed, documented, supported by testimony from soldiers who'd witnessed the same violations but lacked the rank or courage to speak officially. 27 pages of evidence that should have resulted in court-martial proceedings and congressional oversight. Instead, I got a meeting with Colonel Webb in his office at 0200, where he explained how military justice actually worked when careers and reputations were at stake. "Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield," he'd said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about institutional politics, "your report raises concerns that could damage unit cohesion and operational effectiveness." Unit cohesion, the magic phrase that made war crimes disappear into administrative adjustments. "With respect, sir," I'd replied, feeling 15 years of military training collide with moral clarity that wouldn't bend. My report documents actions that violate both military law and international conventions. These incidents require investigation. Webb smiled then, not with warmth, but with the particular satisfaction that comes from holding cards nobody else can see. "What your report documents," he said, opening a file that contained photographs I hadn't known existed, "is an officer with a drinking problem who compromised operational security by consuming alcohol in a combat zone." The photographs were real, taken 6 months earlier during a brief stand-down period when medical officers had been authorized to consume beer 2 cans per person, distributed through official channels, part of morale operations that had been approved at division level. But in the context Webb was creating, those photographs told a different story. The story of an officer who couldn't handle combat stress, who'd turned to alcohol, who'd compromised her judgment and credibility through substance abuse. "Your choice, Lieutenant Colonel," Webb continued, his voice carrying the finality of someone who'd played this game before. "Withdraw your report and accept administrative separation for alcohol-related misconduct. Clean discharge, full benefits, no criminal charges. Or proceed with accusations against a decorated combat commander and face courts-martial for conduct unbecoming, failure to maintain standards, and whatever other charges we discover during our investigation of your habits." I stared at those photographs, evidence of authorized recreational activity transformed into proof of misconduct through selective framing and malicious interpretation. Around me, Webb's office was decorated with awards, commendations, photographs of him with senators and generals, the accumulated evidence of a career built on competence and connections. The choice wasn't really a choice. Fight the system and face destruction through fabricated charges, or accept disgrace and keep quiet about war crimes that would remain buried in classified files forever. I chose disgrace. Signed papers that characterized my departure as alcohol-related misconduct. Accepted a narrative that would follow me for the rest of my life, protecting operations that had saved American lives while destroying my reputation among people who would never understand what I'd actually sacrificed. But I kept copies. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence that proved what had really happened in that compound, what Webb had actually done, why I'd really left the Army. Stored in a safety deposit box in Arlington, Virginia, waiting for the day when congressional oversight committees would finally have jurisdiction to investigate incidents that had been classified beyond reach of normal justice. That day came 18 months after my family's Christmas dinner humiliation. Senator Elizabeth Warren's Armed Services Subcommittee launched investigations into systemic ethics violations in Special Operations Commands that made front-page news and forced the Pentagon to declassify documents they'd planned to keep secret for decades. Webb was arrested on 17 counts of violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, court-martialed, convicted. Sentenced to 12 years at Fort Leavenworth while congressional hearings revealed the scope of what he'd done, who'd been protected, and how many officers like me had chosen disgrace over silence. My real service record was released as part of those hearings. 3 Bronze Star medals, 2 Purple Hearts. 15 years of exemplary service culminating in the moral courage to report crimes that cost me everything I'd thought I cared about. But that vindication was still months away from Dad's Christmas dinner. That night, I could only sit there, absorbing his lies while carrying truths that would vindicate me when justice finally moved faster than institutional politics. The irony was perfect and devastating. They thought they were witnessing my lowest moment, not knowing they were seeing the cost of my highest achievement, choosing integrity over career, truth over safety, service over silence. Tomorrow, I would wake up in my small apartment in Falls Church, Virginia, working as a medical administrator at a civilian hospital, earning a third of my military salary while former colleagues avoided my calls and family members whispered about my problems. But someday soon they would read the truth. All of it. And understand exactly what their failure daughter had sacrificed to keep America safe from enemies both foreign and domestic. The girl they'd pitied had chosen honor over reputation. The woman they'd dismissed had become someone history would remember for refusing to be silent when silence protected the guilty. 6 months later, the truth arrived through a Washington Post alert that lit up my cousin Jennifer's phone at 7:23 a.m. on a June morning. She'd been scrolling casually, expecting gossip and politics, until a headline nearly made her drop the device. Congressional hearings reveal Army cover, up, decorated officer Lauren Whitfield forced out for reporting war crimes. By 7:31, the article detonated inside our family WhatsApp group like a precision strike. 27 relatives who'd lived for half a year certain that I was a failure now faced testimony, photographs, and Pentagon documents proving otherwise. Screenshots flew. Excerpts of generals awarding me commendations. Quotes from soldiers whose lives I'd saved. One line stood out, spoken by Sergeant Major Torres, a man I'd operated on under mortar fire. She saved my life. She saved dozens of lives. She's a hero who was punished for her integrity. Hero. That word ricocheted through the family chat like shrapnel. I was at my desk in Georgetown Medical Center, processing insurance claims for $38,000 a year, when Mom called, her voice trembling. Lauren, I just read. Oh God, what did we do? One by one, the truth gutted my relatives. Uncle Robert reread his Christmas jokes about me, throwing away my career, while staring at my Bronze Star citations. Cousin Dave scrolled congressional testimony between meetings at his law firm, realizing his drinking problem jokes had been built on lies. And then there was Dad. Alone in his mahogany study, he read the full 6-page report. How I had exposed Colonel Webb's crimes. How political machinery destroyed my career. How I'd bled for principles the Army itself had betrayed. On his desk lay a photograph of me receiving the Purple Heart, flanked by General Morrison, who testified before Congress. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield embodies the highest traditions of American service. Her courage in reporting violations, knowing it would end her career, marks her as one of our finest leaders. The Army's treatment of her is a stain on our institution. A stain on the Army, while my father had been staining me. The family group chat went silent for the first time in 3 years. Then Jennifer whispered into the void, "I feel sick." We laughed at her. Dave added, "She saved 200 soldiers," and I made jokes. But the one that pierced deepest came from my 8-year-old nephew. Aunt Lauren lost everything because she refused to stay silent about war crimes. She's the most honorable person in our family, and we treated her like trash. Honorable. A word never once spoken about me at family gatherings, now voiced by the youngest, who understood what the adults never had, that integrity costs more than comfort. By nightfall, my phone exploded with calls, texts, apologies. Dad's voicemail landed at 11:47 p.m., his voice cracked. "Lauren, I read everything. I know what you sacrificed. I know what I said at Christmas. I'm so sorry. You're not a failure. You never were. You're the best of us. And I destroyed you for it." No. The best of us. Words I had longed to hear, arriving too late, dulled by years of damage. Vindication wasn't triumphant, it was hollow, tinged with sadness for time lost and wounds that could never fully heal. I had chosen honor over approval, truth over comfort. For 6 months, I carried shame that wasn't mine to bear. Now they finally knew. Every medal, every life saved, every act of courage. They knew the truth I had lived all along, that their failure had been someone else's hero. That their disappointment had been a decorated officer who refused to compromise what was right. For the first time, they had nothing left to say, only silence, and within it, finally, recognition. I arrived wearing a simple black dress and the same silver watch I'd worn during my last Pentagon briefing. No uniform, no medals visible, just the quiet confidence that came from no longer needing to prove anything to anyone in that room. Dad sat at the head of the table, aged 10 years and 8 months. The Washington Post investigation had been followed by CNN interviews, Pentagon press conferences, congressional testimony that made my story national news. Every detail of what had actually happened in Afghanistan, why I'd really left the Army, what I'd sacrificed to report war crimes that would have remained buried forever without my moral courage. The silence stretched for 20 minutes. Polite conversation about weather, work, safe topics, that avoided the elephant in the room, the fact that everyone at that table had been catastrophically wrong about the woman sitting among them. Finally, Uncle Robert cleared his throat. "Lauren," he said, his voice carrying shame I'd never heard before, "I owe you an apology." We all do. What we said last Christmas. What we believed about you. It was unconscionable. I looked at this man who'd spent Christmas dinner making jokes about my failures, now struggling to find words adequate for the magnitude of his error. "We read everything," Cousin Dave added quietly. "The congressional testimony, the Pentagon documents, the statements from soldiers you saved. We had no idea what you'd actually done, what you'd actually sacrificed." What I'd sacrificed. 15 years of exemplary service, destroyed to protect war criminals who'd finally faced justice. A reputation demolished to maintain operational security that had kept American soldiers alive. A family relationship shattered because some truths couldn't be shared until congressional subpoenas forced them into daylight. "You were a hero," Jennifer whispered, tears in her eyes. "You've always been a hero. And we treated you like..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. We all remembered what they'd treated me like. That's when Dad finally spoke. "Lauren." His voice cracked on my name. "I don't know how to apologize for what I did to you. What I said that night. It was unforgivable. You sacrificed everything to do what was right, and I destroyed you for it because I was too ignorant to understand what real honor looked like." I looked at my father, this man who'd spent 40 years teaching me that success meant profit margins and social approval, now confronting the reality that his daughter had achieved something he'd never comprehend, the kind of moral courage that costs everything and regrets nothing. "Dad," I said, my voice steady with clarity that had taken 8 months of therapy to achieve. "You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted to make me small in front of everyone who mattered to us. But here's what you didn't understand then, and what I finally understand now. The table went silent, 27 people holding their breath while I spoke truths that had been building for decades. The truth doesn't vanish because you lie about it. It doesn't disappear because people choose comfortable fiction over difficult reality. You called me a failure, a drunk, a disappointment, but the Army called me something else. I paused, feeling the weight of every medal I'd earned, every life I'd saved, every choice I'd made when choosing right meant losing everything. They called me Lieutenant Colonel. They called me decorated combat veteran. They called me someone willing to sacrifice her career rather than stay silent about war crimes. They called me hero. The word hit that dining room like incoming artillery. Hero. Not from me, from congressional testimony, Pentagon officials, soldiers whose lives I'd saved during 3 combat deployments. And you know what I realized reading those articles about myself? I continued, looking directly at Dad. I don't need your permission to be proud of what I did. I don't need your approval to know my worth. I don't need your understanding to validate choices that saved American lives. Around me, relatives who'd spent a year avoiding my calls were nodding, some crying, all of them confronting the reality that they'd been wrong about everything that mattered. The truth was written in the lives I saved, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, in the oaths I kept. In the battles I fought in places you'll never see, for reasons you'll never fully understand. That truth will always speak louder than your laughter. Uncle Robert stood then, moving around the table to where I sat today. This man who'd made jokes about my wasted potential now looked at me with something approaching reverence. We should have been proud all along, he said, his hand on my shoulder. We should have trusted you. We should have known that someone with your integrity would never do what we accused you of. The silence that followed was different from last year's laughter. This was the silence of people finally understanding that they'd been in the presence of someone extraordinary all along, someone whose achievements dwarfed their suburban successes in ways they were only now beginning to comprehend. Later, driving home to my apartment in Falls Church, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Not the broken woman who'd absorbed their mockery 12 months ago, but someone who'd finally learned the difference between needing approval and deserving respect. The girl they'd mocked had become the woman her country honored. The daughter they'd pitied had become the hero history would remember. And in the silence between their apologies and the steady tick of time moving forward, that transformation felt exactly like the victory it had always been, not over them, but over the need for them to understand. Some truths are bigger than family dinners. Some achievements transcend suburban approval. Some sacrifices echo through history long after the laughter stops. Lauren's story reminds us that integrity sometimes costs everything we think we want, that family approval isn't worth compromising our principles, and that the people who truly matter will eventually see the truth even when it takes congressional hearings to make it visible. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes, the people who choose principle over popularity, truth over comfort, service over recognition. The ones who pay the real price for keeping the rest of us safe. Because the most important question isn't whether your family believes your story, it's whether you're willing to live a story worth believing in, even when the people closest to you can't see its value. Share this story with someone who's ever been judged for choices others didn't understand, who's ever sacrificed reputation for truth, who's ever learned that real honor doesn't require an audience. The truth will always speak louder than their laughter.